one of the things I'm curious about when it comes to orgasmic meditation specifically is because it's a partnered practice, what happens between both people? So there's an experience that I'm having, right?
Right,
And there's the experience that the stroker is having, which are different but complementary
right.
experiences. And then there's the shared experience. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to what you saw in terms of each individual, right? So in the stroker and the strokee, and then what, if anything, did you see in the combination of the two? Because, one of the things I'm fascinated by is, a lot of these, and I know this for myself, right? Like I do yoga, I do meditation. I also, not currently, but in the past, am an advocate and a practitioner of psychedelics, right? But for the most part, unless I'm in a group, they're individual experiences.
Right,
Whereas orgasmic meditation is a partnered practice. So,
right.
one of the questions is, okay, well, there's my mystical experience I'm having, and there's my partner's mystical experience that they're having, but are we also having a shared mystical experience? And if so, how does that work in the brain?
Right. Well, yeah, so uh, um I mean the orgasmic meditation does have an interesting niche in that regard because what you're talking about is um is a paired practice. So I mean, you think about practices in general, you have individual practices, which is what a lot of practices are, and just in
Hmm.
their house or person meditating and they're just focusing on themselves. You have something like orgasmic meditation where it is a very specifically paired practice. As you mentioned, it's two people who are interacting with each other. And then you have group rituals, which are many
Yeah.
people practicing together. So actually, yeah, orgasmic meditation also has this kind of unique little fit in between the individual practices and the group practices because it's a group practice, but it's a very, very
Right.
small group. And a lot has been conceived of in terms of what's going on there. One of the advantages of studying something like Om is that you can, as we have done, and we can talk about in a second, but in our study that we did with orgasmic meditation, we did look at both people's brains.
Yes.
Arguably speaking, we could go to a church or a synagogue or a mosque and try to, hook up, 20 people's brains and see if they kind of connect with each other, resonate with each other. There's certainly evidence that human brains do resonate with each other, especially when they're kind of in communication and connected to. Obviously, if you're sitting in some house of worship and people are singing a hymn, there's a rhythmic element to that, and to some
Yeah.
degree, everyone kind of gets entrained into that rhythm. So theoretically, we would see similar kinds of stimuli going on in the brain itself, in the auditory cortex, maybe in the in the visual areas of the brain, maybe what they're saying. And then you kind of get into lockstep where everybody's kind of doing the same thing, but that also then has the ability to affect these areas of the brain, including parts of the parietal lobe, because the parietal lobe is not just the spatial representation of ourself, but the whole point of that is how that self fits within the social framework of the world. And so there's actually very specific social areas in the parietal lobe that are part of that whole process. So when you say when one says I feel connected to X, the what we are designed to be connected to is each other. So we're
Yeah.
designed to be connected to our family members, to a loved one, to a mate, to a child or whatever. Um, and so when that becomes extrapolated to the group, to God, to the universe, whatever, then you have these kinds of expanded perceptions of the self to other in a kind of social context. And actually, there certainly a lot of people think about God in a kind of social context, in terms of having a relationship with
Right.
God. Um, so, now, going back to the specifics of the question. So when we looked at people who were engaged in orgasmic meditation, I think the findings that we reported were very much what we would hypothesize based on what we know about orgasmic meditation, in that in our study we had the stroker was always a male, the strokee was always a female, and so the females in our study did have different changes going on in their brain, similar to some of the things that we just talked about, changes in the parietal lobe and frontal lobe and so forth. The males who were involved in the process had changes slightly, it was a slightly different pattern, but still, there was overlap. So again, there was sort of this sense that they were engaged in the same kind of practice. They were having similar kinds of experience, similar experiences, but complementary experiences. They weren't exactly this, was certainly not exactly the same. And that would be expected. And then what we also looked at was how, whether or not there were areas of the brain that, in the two individuals that actually had some registration to each other, some correlation with each other.
Right.
And we did find that, we did find that that certain areas seem to correlate with each other, that that helped us to kind of understand what that connection would be. And for the most part, these were some of the social areas of the brain. So when people did have these kinds of experiences and were engaged in the OM practice, there were areas of the brain that correlated with each other, that again, it had to do with some of the emotional areas of the brain, an area of the brain called the insula, for example, as well as an area of the brain called the precuneus, which is part of the parietal lobe, and it's one of the big social areas of the brain. So, so I think, that speaks to this idea that it really has a kind of social, it really focuses on a social person-to-person connection. That's very interesting. And then, of course, now the next study, so to speak, would be, do we see that same kind of thing when we look at larger groups, or maybe even in individuals who are
Right.
having a kind of personalized experience? And that in and of itself is interesting, going back to the early question that you asked about mystical experiences, which is that some of them have a very personalized flavor to it, that, I am having a relationship with God. Others have more of a non-relationship. There's no me, there's no, everything's just one, or something like that. So it again, and one would expect to see slightly different changes
Right.
going on in the brain depending on what that person felt. And yet people call all of them spiritual experiences or mystical experiences.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It's so, yeah, there's so much, and it's so fascinating.